The elders gathered on the highest cliff above the valley, their long robes fluttering in the cold wind, their faces lined with years of watching the world and seeing what others could not. The sky stretched wide above them, painted with streaks of fire and ash from the setting sun, and the river below wound like a silver snake through the darkening land. They stood in silence for a long moment, feeling the weight of what they had to say, and then one by one they spoke, their voices low but carrying far across the empty air. They spoke of visions that had come to them in dreams, visions of fire and storm, of mountains crumbling and forests falling, and seas rising over the land. They told of people running through streets of stone that cracked beneath their feet, and of cities that vanished into smoke and shadow, of animals fleeing in terror, and of skies that tore themselves open with lightning that split the heavens into impossible shapes. But the villagers below the cliff laughed. They saw only old faces and trembling voices, and they shook their heads and went back to their daily chores, tending animals and digging the earth, planting seeds that would grow, and listening to the wind in the trees, and thinking that the elders were lost to memories of things that never were. And the elders felt a cold sorrow deep in their bones, because they knew that the laughter and the turning away of the people would not stop. What was coming, that the force they had seen rising within humanity would not be turned aside by mockery or disbelief. Yet still, they tried, they gestured toward the distant horizon, toward the mountains that trembled at their visions, toward the rivers that seemed to swell and pulse like veins of the earth itself. And they told the people to watch, to listen to the signs in the clouds, in the stars, in the songs of the birds, for the time would come when every warning would be needed and every choice would matter. But still the people shook their heads and whispered among themselves about superstition and fear and old tales that had no place in the sunlit world. They lived in the elders, watched the children who played at the edge of the cliff, unaware of the danger of falling, and they saw in their eyes the first sparks of the unstoppable power that they had come to know. The way the children laughed and ran without hesitation, climbing rocks, leaping over streams, speaking to each other with voices full of courage and curiosity. And the elders knew that these were the ones who would shape the future, the ones who would rise above the laughter and doubt, the ones who would carry humanity beyond the limits anyone had imagined. But still, the elders felt the ache of frustration and helplessness, because no matter how hard they spoke, no matter how fiercely they gestured toward the coming storms, the people below would not believe, they would not see. And so the elders remained on the cliff long after the sun disappeared behind the mountains, letting the cold seep into their bones, letting the wind howl around them, carrying the whispers of the future. And they knew that though no one believed, yet the truth would not be stopped. It would rise, it would grow, it would sweep across the lands unstoppable. And the elders would wait and watch and hope that someday someone would remember their words. The elders left the cliff at dawn, their robes damp with dew, and their faces pale with thought and worry, for they carried the weight of the visions that haunted their dreams, and every step down the winding path through the forest was heavy with the knowledge of what was to come. And they spoke among themselves in low murmurs about the power they had seen rising in humanity, about the fire that burned in the hearts of the young, about the relentless will to build, destroy, create, and conquer. And they knew that it was not a force that could be contained by fear or walls, or even by the mountains that stretched like silent guardians across the land. And as they walked through the villages that slept beneath the rising sun, they tried again to speak to the people, trying to warn the blacksmiths who hammered iron into shapes that could not yet exist, trying to warn the farmers who tilled the soil, unaware of the forces that would one day demand more than harvests. And still the people smiled politely and shook their heads and said the elders were dreaming old dreams, dreaming of shadows and smoke and storms that would never come. And the elders felt a tightening in their chests, but they did not stop. They walked from village to village, speaking of the children who carried sparks of the future in their laughter, of the builders who would reach higher than the clouds, of the inventors who would make machines that roared louder than the rivers that ran through the valleys. And they spoke of the unstoppable power that would grow like a river breaking through the dam, like a fire consuming the dry grass of the plains, like a wind that bends even the strongest trees. Yet no one listened, no one looked beyond the warmth of their fires and the comfort of their familiar lives. And the elders began to feel the weight of time pressing against their shoulders, for they knew the seeds of power were already growing in the hearts of the young, and that there would come a day when humanity would rise like a storm that could not be turned aside. And still the people laughed, thinking of old men lost in visions, thinking that the world could never change so quickly, so violently, so completely, and the elders watched. The children running through the fields, chasing birds, climbing trees, jumping over streams, with unthinking courage, and they saw the power that would one day carry them beyond mountains, rivers, oceans, and even the sky itself. And they spoke to each other in whispers, hoping that their words would find a memory in the hearts of those who would rise, and that the laughter of the present would not drown the warning of the future. For the power they saw was not gentle, it was not small, it was like a wave gathering strength that was relentless, unstoppable, 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 and the elders felt both awe and fear, for they knew that when the time came, humanity would move forward without hesitation, and no force could hold it back. And though they were old and weary, they could not turn away from the truth, they could not close their eyes to the fire they had seen growing in the hearts of the children, and so they walked on, and spoke on, and hoped that one day someone would believe, and that when the storm of humanity came, the world would not be destroyed entirely by disbelief, but by the unstoppable strength of its own children. And the elders carried that knowledge quietly and deeply as they vanished into the rising sun, letting their words drift on the wind to fall on ears that were not yet ready to hear them. The villagers continued their daily lives, unaware of the storm that brewed on the horizon. Their laughter mingled with the wind that blew through the narrow streets. The children ran barefoot over the worn stones, chasing shadows and birds, and the elders watched from the edges of the village, their eyes heavy with the knowledge of what was to come. But the people only saw old men and women with long robes and faces carved by time, and they shook their heads and whispered that the elders were lost to dreams that belonged to another age, that the stories of fire and storm were nothing more than tales to frighten children. And still the elders spoke, their voices rising above the chatter of the market, the hammering of iron, the bleating of sheep, and the rustle of the wheat in the fields. They spoke of the power that slept in the hearts of humanity, of the force that could not be stopped by walls or swords or even by the heavens themselves. And the villagers turned away, some with polite smiles, some with scoffs, some with open laughter, mocking the trembling voices that tried to pierce their comfort. But the elders did not falter. They walked among the crowds, touching hands, speaking to those who would listen, even if the listening was fleeting. And in the eyes of the youngest children they saw sparks, the first sparks of the unstoppable energy that would shape the world. They saw the boldness in their steps, the curiosity in their fingers reaching for everything, the wonder in their eyes that demanded more than the world had yet given. And the elders knew that these sparks would grow into fires that could not be tamed, fires that would consume fear and doubt and ignite ambition and courage and creation. And yet the people laughed and went about their lives thinking only of the next meal, the next festival, the next sunrise. And the elders felt the ache of frustration that comes when one knows the future and watches it approach unnoticed. They tried to show the cracks in the mountains that whispered of earthquakes to come, the clouds that twisted unnaturally and roared with winds that carried warnings across the fields, the rivers that swelled with hidden currents of power. And still the people ignored them. They said the elders were afraid of nothing, that there were no monsters in the world that could touch them, that their lives were safe in the warmth of the sun and the rhythm of the seasons. And the elders watched the people go on, weaving their lives through the quiet threads of destiny that they could not see, and they felt the weight of inevitability pressing on their shoulders, like the sky itself was bending down to touch the earth. For the unstoppable force was growing, the children who would one day climb mountains and sail seas, the dreamers who would invent fire in new ways, the builders who would reach beyond the clouds. These forces were alive in the ordinary laughter, in the songs, in the curiosity, in the stubbornness of the human spirit. And the elders spoke again and again, hoping that some memory would take root, hoping that some glance, some thought, some silent acknowledgement of the truth would carry forward to the day when the storm could no longer be ignored. And though the villagers continued to laugh and turn away, the elders knew that one day all would see, one day all would feel the power that was unstoppable, and that day would come whether anyone believed or not. And they waited quietly, with hearts heavy with hope and dread. Years passed, and the children who had once played at the edges of the villages grew taller, stronger, and bolder. They climbed mountains, with bare hands crossed rivers that roared like living beasts, and walked through forests that whispered secrets. Older than the villages themselves, the elders watched quietly from the shadows of trees and cliffs, seeing the sparks of power they had foretold taking root and growing into flames that could not be contained. The blacksmiths who had once laughed at their warnings now forged machines that sang with heat and fire and light. The farmers who had ignored visions of storm now built canals that twisted through the fields like silver snakes carrying life to every corner, and the inventors who had been mere dreamers were now creators who shaped the air with flying machines and the land with iron beasts that moved faster than horses, and the elders felt both awe and fear, for they knew the unstoppable power was no longer a whisper, was rising like a wave, gathering strength with each passing day. The people around them marveled at the wonders, but they did not understand the danger, the fire that burned within their own hearts and minds. They saw progress as triumph, but the elders saw momentum, a force that could not be slowed, a river that would carve valleys even where no water flowed. Yet the children of the villages, who had once chased shadows and birds, now chased knowledge and mastery over the world they built. Towers that scraped the clouds, and bridges that spanned rivers wider than any before. They made machines that roared and sang, and flew through the air, and in every step they took, they pushed farther than anyone had dared to dream. And still the elders spoke in whispers to one another, hoping that the growing power would find guidance, hoping that the unstoppable force would not destroy itself in ignorance and pride. And yet they saw the recklessness to the hunger for more, the desire to conquer every mountain, river, forest, and sky, and they knew that humanity would not stop, for no one could stop it, and every invention, every building, every step across uncharted lands was proof that their warnings had not been lies, that the power they foresaw was real, and alive, and breathing through the children, now grown into adults. They moved with the certainty of the unstoppable, and even the elders who had once feared disbelief, now feared what unchecked ambition could bring. They watched as humans sailed across oceans and tamed fire and light and energy, bending the world closer to their will. The cities spread wider, taller, faster than anyone had imagined. The rivers were harnessed, the winds were captured, the earth itself reshaped by hands that could not be denied, and the elders knew that the laughter and doubt of the past were gone, replaced by awe, determination, and unstoppable momentum. And though they still whispered warnings into the wind, few listened, for humanity was too busy building, too busy reaching, too busy becoming the unstoppable force that had been foretold. And the elders stood quietly at the edges of the world, watching as prophecy turned to reality, and knowing that one day the power they had warned about would shape everything, and no one would be able to turn it back or contain it or deny it. And the world was changing under their very eyes. Every triumph of humanity brought new marvels and new dangers. The cities stretched higher and wider than ever before, their towers scraping the clouds and their streets pulsing with light and sound. The elders watched from the hills and cliffs as machines roared across the land, carrying humans farther, faster, and higher than anyone could have imagined. The rivers were tamed and twisted into canals that glimmered in the sun, the forests carved into patterns of order and efficiency, the mountains mined and shaped into monuments of stone and iron. And yet for every triumph, there was hunger for more, a desire to push farther, to reach beyond what had already been achieved. The unstoppable force the elders had warned of was alive in the hearts of men and women, in the spark of curiosity, in the pounding of ambition, in the roar of engines and the hum of electricity. It moved like a river, breaking through every dam, every restraint, and the elders whispered among themselves of the dangers of momentum unchecked, of the force that could sweep away all caution, all wisdom, all restraint. And still the people celebrated their victories. They marveled at the wonders they had created from nothing. They did not see the shadow behind the glory, the cost of relentless progress, the quiet tremors beneath the earth, the swelling of rivers beyond their banks, the cries of forests and skies. And the elders felt the ache of fear and pride entwined at once, for humanity was unstoppable, 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 and it was beautiful and terrifying all at once. They walked through the streets of the largest cities and saw the faces of the young and the old, their eyes wide with awe, with pride, with hunger, with dreams that could not be contained. They heard the hum of the machines that built the bridges and the towers, and the flying machines that carried humans over seas and mountains. They smelled the smoke and the fire of forges and engines, and felt the vibration of power in the ground beneath their feet. And they knew that nothing could halt the momentum that had been set in motion by generations of curiosity, courage, and relentless ambition. And still they spoke in whispers of balance, of restraint, of listening to the earth and sky, of remembering that power without wisdom could consume everything in its path. But the voices were small against the tide of creation, against the roar of humanity, moving forward faster than anyone had ever imagined, faster than the winds, faster than the rivers, faster than the mountains themselves. And the elders saw the children who had grown into adults walking among the throngs, building and shaping, claiming and conquering, with hearts and minds ablaze with unstoppable fire, and they realized that the prophecy had been fulfilled. The unstoppable power they had foreseen was no longer a vision, no longer a warning. It was alive, it was breathing, it was moving across the world, unstoppable. And yet still the elders hoped that somewhere within the triumphs and the inventions and the relentless momentum, some spark of caution, some whisper of wisdom would survive to guide the force they had predicted, to temper it, to prevent it from consuming itself and the world. And as the sun set behind the towering cities, casting long shadows across the rivers and fields, the elders stood, quietly knowing that humanity had become what they had always warned of, a force that could not be stopped, a wave that could not be turned, a fire that could not be contained. And they watched and waited for what would come next. Then came the first tremors of consequence, small at first, almost imperceptible shaking of the earth, that made the villagers glance up from their work, the rivers that began to swell faster than they had ever seen, the winds that tore through the trees with a fury that startled even the elders who had warned of such things. The unstoppable momentum of humanity had grown too fast, too wide, too powerful, and the balance of the world began to tremble under the weight of ambition and creation. The people celebrated their inventions, their machines, their towering cities that scraped the clouds, and even as the storms began to whisper warnings, they ignored them, convinced that nothing could stop them, that their power was absolute, that the river could be bent, the wind tamed, the earth reshaped to fit their will. And the elders walked among the chaos silently, watching, knowing that the unstoppable force they had warned of was now colliding with the fragile boundaries of the natural, the world. And they whispered to each other that the first cracks were forming, that the fire of humanity had grown too large and too hot for the earth to contain. They saw the winds that tore through the forests, uprooting ancient trees. They saw the rivers that surged over their banks, washing away fields and homes. And they heard the first cries of animals, fleeing in terror. And the people still believed that progress would protect them, that the machines they had built, the cities they had raised, the technology they had mastered would shield them from consequence. But the elders knew that power without restraint has a price, that even the strongest walls cannot contain that momentum without pause, will crash like a wave into everything in its path. And they saw the children who had grown into adults, pushing further, faster, building higher, larger, stronger, conquering more than anyone had dared imagine, crossing oceans and climbing mountains. And the winds of consequence began to follow them, shaking the ground beneath the cities, threatening bridges and towers with every gust. The rivers surged faster, carrying debris and fear along with water. The skies darkened with storms that seemed alive, as if they too recognized the unstoppable force of humanity and tried to warn them. Yet still the people pressed on, laughing, defying nature with every new invention, every new creation, every new achievement. And the elders watched with hearts heavy with awe and dread, knowing that the unstoppable force was unstoppable yet vulnerable to itself. The momentum of humanity could not be slowed, could not be turned, could not be contained, and still it moved forward with blazing certainty. Unstoppable, 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 like a fire that consumes everything in its path. Unstoppable like a river that carves valleys where none existed. Unstoppable like the wind that bends the strongest trees. And even as the first real tremors of consequence shook cities and forests and rivers, the people refused to see, refusing to believe that their unstoppable power could ever bring ruin. And the elders felt the weight of inevitability pressing down on their shoulders, that someday the force they had warned of would clash fully with the world itself, and that day would test every dream, every triumph, every spark of human ambition. And they stood quietly on the cliffs and hills, watching the unstoppable momentum surge forward, knowing that nothing could turn it back, nothing could contain it, nothing could stop it. When the earth shook and the seas rose, the people finally began to feel fear. Tremors ran through the streets and fields. Buildings quivered and windows rattled. The skies darkened with clouds that twisted unnaturally, and lightning split the heavens into shapes that made the bravest hearts tremble. Yet still the people struggled to believe. The elders had warned them. They remembered the stories whispered on the wind, the trembling voices of old men and women speaking of unstoppable power, and they shook their heads and said it was impossible. It could not be real. It was only exaggeration and rumor. Yet the cracks in the mountains grew wider, the rivers devoured the banks and fields, the forests bent and broke, and the first cries of panic rose as animals fled in terror. Humans scrambled to protect what they could, moving through chaos with hearts pounding and minds grasping at explanations that could not come fast enough. The elders watched from the cliffs and hills, silent witnesses to the unfolding storm, knowing that the unstoppable force they had predicted was now fully awakened and colliding with a world unprepared. The children who had once laughed and chased shadows now ran with faces pale, their eyes wide with the recognition of what they had become, part of a force beyond their control. The cities that had been built higher and stronger began to shiver and shake. The bridges that spanned rivers groaned under the weight of water and wind, and the people screamed as their creations betrayed them. For nature had not been tamed, it had only been challenged, and now it responded with fury unstoppable as humanity itself. The elders moved quietly through the panic, offering what words they could, teaching who would listen, how to survive, how to bend with the force, instead of resisting it. But few listened. Panic drowned wisdom, and fear silenced hope, and the unstoppable power pressed onward, reshaping the world as it moved, destroying and creating all at once. The waves surged over coasts, swallowing homes. The wind tore through towers that scraped the clouds, and lightning struck indiscriminately, setting forests and fields ablaze. The people who had once laughed at warnings now scattered, desperately trying to protect their lives, their families, their cities. And yet, even in the chaos, the unstoppable force of humanity did not falter. It adapted, it endured, it pressed on with the certainty that nothing could stop it. The elders watched the destruction and the triumph, intertwined, knowing that this was the moment when prophecy became reality, when warnings were finally understood, yet too late for many to heed the lessons in time and space. And the unstoppable power of humanity roared across the world, reshaping every coast, mountain, river, and plain, bending even the elements to its relentless momentum. The people who had ignored the warnings finally saw the truth, and the elders knew that though they had spoken, and no one believed until now, the unstoppable force was alive, unstoppable, 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 and nothing could contain it, or turn it back, or stop it from moving forward into the world forever changed. Yet humanity did not falter. It endured the storms and the fires, the floods and the tremors that had once seemed impossible. It rose from the ruins of shattered cities and broken forests and scorched fields, with hands and hearts determined to rebuild. Stronger, faster, better. The elders watched quietly from cliffs and hills, seeing the unstoppable force they had predicted now fully alive, moving through the chaos like a river, carving new paths through the land. The people learned quickly, adapting to the new rules of a world that had been reshaped by their own ambition and the fury of nature. They built walls that could withstand the floods, and towers that could resist the wind, and engines that could navigate the storms. Yet still the unstoppable momentum of humanity was not sated. It reached farther and higher, with every passing day, exploring lands that had once been deemed unreachable, climbing mountains that had resisted generations, and sailing seas that had swallowed whole fleets before their time. They learned to harness the fire of the sky, the power of the rivers, and the winds that tore through the forests, bending the world closer to their will. And even as they rebuilt, they remembered the elders' words, though few listened with understanding. The unstoppable power was unstoppable because it did not pause. It did not hesitate. It moved through triumph and disaster alike. It reshaped everything in its path. And the elders saw both the beauty and the danger of what humanity had become. They saw the courage in the faces of the builders and inventors, the determination in the explorers, and the resilience in the survivors. They saw hope in the hearts of those who refused to give up even when the storms raged, the fires burned, and the earth trembled. Yet they also saw recklessness. They saw ambition that ignored consequence. They saw pride that defied caution and wisdom. They saw a force that could destroy itself if it did not learn to bend with the momentum it had created. And still, humanity pressed onward, unstoppable, unstoppable, unstoppable. It moved across mountains, rivers, forests, and seas, leaving traces of creation and destruction in its wake. It reshaped the world not just through technology and invention, but through courage and willpower, and the spark of relentless curiosity that burned in every human heart. The elders stood quietly on the cliffs and hills, watching the unstoppable force grow and stretch beyond the limits of imagination, knowing that the stories they had told, the warnings they had whispered, had not been ignored entirely, that in the memory of some hearts, in the courage of some souls, the truth had taken root, that humanity could survive, could endure, could rise even from the ashes of its own mistakes, and that the unstoppable power that had once been only prophecy was now reality, alive and breathing. moving forward across the world forever unstoppable, and though chaos and triumph were entwined, they knew that the journey was far from over, that the unstoppable momentum of humanity would continue to reshape everything, and that the elders could only watch and hope that wisdom and courage would travel alongside ambition and power to guide the force that could not be contained. In the quiet moments after the storms, when the wind finally stilled and the rivers settled, and the fires burned themselves low, the elders walked among the remnants of cities and forests and fields, seeing both devastation and triumph in every corner of the world. They saw humans rising from the ashes, stronger, wiser, and bolder than ever before, their hands shaping the earth, their minds bending fire and water and air to new purposes, their hearts filled with courage and determination. Unstoppable, unstoppable, unstoppable. The elders remembered the days when their voices had trembled with warnings and visions and no one had believed them, when laughter and mockery had drowned out the truths they carried, when the world had seemed blind to the power that lay within the children now grown into adults. And yet here they were, the unstoppable force, fully alive, moving across mountains, rivers, and seas, reshaping everything in its path. And the elders felt both pride and sorrow: pride for the courage and creativity and resilience of humanity, sorrow for the price that had been paid for disbelief and ambition. Unchecked, they walked through the rebuilt cities and saw towers that reached the clouds and bridges that spanned oceans. They saw machines that flew through the skies and vehicles that moved faster than the winds. They saw children playing in streets that had once been rivers of destruction, and they knew that the spark of unstoppable power they had predicted had become a flame of fire that could never be extinguished. They saw humans reaching farther than any before, discovering lands hidden and secrets long buried, bending the very elements to their will. And yet the elders also saw the remnants of recklessness, the scars of ambition unchecked, the quiet reminders that power without wisdom can consume everything. And they whispered among themselves that the story of the elders had not ended. It had only become memory, memory etched into the minds of those who had survived, memory carried in the courage of the young, memory whispered in the wind that swept across the mountains and valleys. The unstoppable force of humanity continued to move forward, shaping the world, creating destruction and beauty in equal measure, proving that the warnings had been true and that nothing could contain it, nothing could turn it back, nothing could stop it from moving ever forward across the earth. And the elders knew that though they had spoken and few had listened, the truth had survived in the hearts of those who had seen the consequences, and the lessons had traveled quietly alongside ambition and power, shaping the unstoppable momentum that would carry humanity into the future. Forever resilient, forever daring, forever unstoppable. And as the sun set behind the rebuilt cities, casting long shadows across mountains, forests, and rivers, the elders stood together, quietly knowing that their warnings had been fulfilled, that humanity had become the unstoppable force they had foretold, and that the story of the elders lived on only in whispers, only in memory, only in the courage and wisdom of those who could guide the power that could never be contained. And they smiled and turned to watch humanity moving forward, shaping the world and the stars and the winds with unstoppable, unstoppable, unstoppable certainty, for they had known the truth, and it had come alive.